I was tasked by Professor Modak to give you his regards. Unfortunately, he had already to leave for the airport, but the group elected a rapporteur. He will be with us momentarily. In the meantime, we can perhaps start with the group on payments for ecosystem services. So, Lakmi, if you could give a brief summary of your discussion.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. We have maybe 10-12 participants on payment for ecosystem services. In fact, on behalf of them, I am trying to discuss here. This whole payment for ecosystem service concept is new to business communities. In fact, new approach in this area. That's why the conceptually is not yet clear yet. That's why it needs to be more clarified what conceptual, is it a voluntary or it should be regulated by different institutions or government entity. This is the main question that we discuss. But in terms of strength, it's a voluntary transaction or voluntary payment itself is a strength for this mechanism. So people may have the willingness to pay for ecosystem service, means this is a good strength. But at the same time, this may be the weakness for this approach. If you say voluntary, people may not have any willingness to pay for this particular. So it needs to be sometimes regulated through the institutions or legal instruments. This is the one thing. The strength, these local communities who are really protecting ecosystem services, forest ecosystems services or ecosystems, they are getting benefits from this whole approach through this incentive-based mechanism. That is one way of incentivizing them. This is the strength. That may encourage them to have more protection of this ecosystem and ecological restoration. So that means this is a more positive externalities in managing ecosystem restoration. These are the key positive things. But in weakness, the valuation, before we try to have this PSE scheme, what could be the value of that particular ecosystem service? The whole valuation is sometimes debatable or sometimes not acceptable or even sometimes difficult. That is a bit weakness. And business communities in particular, if they have not seen the additional benefits or additional business from this particular approach, they may have not interest on investing this as a payment mechanism. And there might be some chances of over exploitation if we are really incentivizing this community. If in terms of very high amounts, they may have some more chances of over exploitation of resources. These are some weaknesses. But in particular to managing this ecosystem upstream, downstream linkage, there need a clear enabling environment in terms of stewardship mechanism with different stakeholders, in terms of certification of products or assurance to buyers. The buyers needs to have assurance that he or she will get the sustainable supply of this particular ecosystem service. That needs to be monitored or compliance, some stewardship mechanism needs to be there. And there is a clear need of some subsidiary organization that needs to be regulated. That will regulate these things. And the institutional capacity is already there. So this is very important. And I recall my presentation as well, the whole issue of tenureship is one of the key issues that even our participants discuss. These are the key enabling environment that needs to be well developed to make sure this whole mechanism financing biodiversity or ecosystem service happen in this area. Thanks. If I miss something, my team members can in fact react on this. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we had a pretty similar theme, voluntary versus mandatory, and the role of governments and the state in the offsets group in which I participated. So Divya, up to you.
So we did really have a very animated discussion on biodiversity offsets. It was indeed a very new topic for all the participants, but they really got a drift. I was worried most people won't even get a drift of what, because it's an entirely new concept to India. But everybody had an opinion on offsets as well. So that was really wonderful. What the main question that we tried to answer was do you think voluntary offsets are scalable in India? And if yes, what enabling framework, regulatory enabling framework can promote voluntary offsets in India? So there was an entire continuum of opinions. On one end, there were a couple of people who questioned the very premise of offsets. They said that no amount of offsetting can actually compensate for the loss of certain biodiversity elements like old growth forests or like threatened and endangered species. So they were right. They picked up a very important debate, point of debate internationally on offsets. Now the rest of them were of the opinion that in India nothing voluntary works. So even if there are a handful of companies which can demonstrate, voluntary offsets will never become mainstream. For example, we had a person from Rio Tinto. She told us that Rio Tinto is doing some kind of offsetting activities for their Bundar project in Madhya Pradesh because it flows from top to bottom. It's their corporate strategy. It's not an India specific strategy. So some MNCs will definitely take up offsetting if it is mandated by their corporate offices. But in India, it's a long way to go before voluntary offsets can become mainstream. And one important reason why some of our friends thought so was because in India, even EIA, the lowest level of the mitigation hierarchy, avoidance, even that is not strong enough. We first need to strengthen the EIA mechanism. Only then we can talk about compensating. We are right now not even able to avoid really deleterious impacts through environmental clearances. Our environmental clearance process needs to be strengthened first, and then we can talk about compensation. Another important point that emerged was that the regulatory compensatory afforestation money that is paid is it's minuscule, it's very small. It's a few lakh rupees for a hectare of old growth forest. So it's not enough. It's not enough. So companies, one school of thought was that companies will have to go beyond this regulatory requirement. Companies will have to voluntarily shell out some funds in order to maintain a license to operate in the local communities. So some of us thought that voluntary offsets will catch up if it is a requirement of the investors and if the communities demand. So what I wanted to clarify among the group was that offsets are not just creation of a habitat. Offsets can be anything. It could be working with endangered species, promoting their, eliminating the factors that lead to their loss. So that was one misconception that I had to clarify. And finally, we realized that tenure rights will become an important issue if voluntary offsets come into picture. Who will own the offset land? So again, activity-based voluntary offsets will come into picture, not habitat-based offsets. And finally, people question, if at all India has to take up offsetting, where is the capacity? The government doesn't even have enough capacity to take up afforestation. Does the private sector have access to the capacity to take up offsets? So these were some of the challenges that we arrive at.
Thank you very much. So let's move straight away to David Myers from UNDP Biofin to summarize the group's discussion on green bonds.
Okay, thank you. We also had a very animated group discussion. We started off by realizing that the green bonds that are out there in the marketplace right now do not cover most biodiversity issues. They're focused on renewable energy and green infrastructure. And so our first challenge was figuring out what would be a type of green bond that would pertain to biodiversity. And so I'll get to some of our suggestions towards the end, but let me just start with strengths and weaknesses. So with strengths, in general, the green bond approach is effective because it's a very simple structure. It's a bond. I'm giving you money, basically lending you money. You're going to pay that money back. Something that the financial industry knows quite well. It could be a great way of bringing in private resources into biodiversity conservation and management, and it can blend different sources of financing. And the weaknesses, of course, is that there's a clear lack of ability to monetize biodiversity. Biodiversity does not throw off streams of money. There are a few opportunities where biodiversity does generate revenue, and we'll talk about how they might be turned into bonds in a second. And then another challenge that doesn't exist with green bonds as they currently exist for renewable energy is it's hard to monitor biodiversity. In general, that's a challenge we have. How would you do that with a green bond? So that said, we did come up with some opportunities. Some of them could work pretty quickly. Some of them are for the future, things to develop. One idea was for pharmaceuticals. So a pharmaceutical company would say, issue a green bond, use it to protect an area, and there was a reference to a pharmaceutical company doing this for a coral reef. So they protected the coral reef, and they'll use it for surveying for potential pharmaceutical drugs. The question about how do you scale that up is something of concern. Ecotourism is an opportunity as well to help, say, finance an ecotourism lodge together with protecting a protected area. There's in the UK there are social bonds that were issued around keeping people out of jail, because having people in jail costs the government money, so they were able to get the government to compensate for the company that issued the bond and produced a better program to keep people out of jail. So they were able to have clear monitoring and pay back for that. That was the first social bond, a precursor of green bonds. And other possibilities include, that could be very interesting, are in sustainable agriculture with, say, agro-biodiversity, managing seed banks and then selling the seeds, selling the commodities that are produced by them. So again, we were looking for some sort of revenue stream that would go back to the buyer of the bond. And then finally, the idea came about maybe blending different potential revenue streams that on their own may not be enough for a green bond, but say that there is a payment for ecosystem service revenue stream from hydrological protection. There was a possibility of an offset. We're using all the different possibilities here. And then ecotourism, or say sustainable forestry. And then you would blend that into a package, sell that package to the investor, and then hope at least one or two of those financial revenue streams would come into play. But overall, there was so these are challenging but interesting opportunities, something to look forward to in the future. And hopefully I covered most of what the group discussed. Thank you.
Thanks, David. So again, a kind of, as I said, common theme in terms of enabling environment. What can governments do? I think that's the salient question for the policy group. So let's hear from the policy group what they discussed. Ravi.
Thank you. Thanks for the group that we had a friendly discussion, not very animated. The one point that came out of the discussion is to reduce the impact per se first, as pointed out by Divya in her presentation as well. How do we mainstream biodiversity so that the cost of maintaining what we have comes less, rather than you damage something and start spending something. So how do we mainstream it at every level of activity? All the three instruments were discussed, PES, offsets and green bonds. The group felt that on PES, all the literature, most of the literature that we have comes from mountainous ecosystems, stream, water discharge and all those kind of things. Nothing much, at least with the group that we had. We did not have too many case studies to fall back on. So we felt that perhaps there is limited replicability, though we have a huge mountain and mountainous country in the north and east and west. Another one is, as very rightly pointed out by Dr. Lakshmi, the evaluation. How reliable are the evaluations and how capable are we in evaluating and getting these things? So these are some of the issues. And then the tenural aspect was also referred to. So these are some of the challenges that we thought that PES would have. With regard to offsets, how strong it is. The regulatory mechanism is firm, that we have money, though we have not spent much, but some money is there, so that will come back. On the voluntary thing, we had one example of CDM, did not perform the way it was expected to, perhaps, though it is in early days. So the group as such was not very sure how the mechanism could work, but were positive to that extent. Yes, it can be looked into, but we were not sure how much would it contribute to the larger scheme of things. What proportion could it play when we are talking about financial resources. With regard to green bonds, yes, the group thought that it is like a low-hanging fruit, so you could fairly readily access. But again, one concern, we did not have any experts to assist us in these things, is how do we ensure that the money that we receive is used on activities that in effect help a large company might use the money for some other purposes that might not be. So I do not know, there must be some mechanisms in place to ensure that. So the group felt that how do we ensure that? So when we were discussing this, the main thing that came out was educating everybody at large, even educating the stakeholders and the public at large, educating the consumer, as if you could call the public in that sense. And then all the three instruments we felt that has potential in a country like India, but we need to take it area based, and which system or which instrument at a given point in time can work better. We don't say A is better than B or B is better than C. We find scope for all three, but it has to be looked into on a particular activity or on a particular site. That's it. I think I have captured most of these things. Thank you.
Thanks, Rabi. I think this brings us to the end of this afternoon's event. Let me try to perhaps provide a brief and subjective summary. As I said, I think one important common theme is this voluntary instruments versus mandatory instruments. Then if mandatory, to what degree is it really prescriptive? Can we find some softer tool promoting the specific instrument? So for instance, without prescribing offsetting right away? Can we create enabling conditions that make some elements in its implementation easier? So this is was one important common stream. Another related to that, another issue I found to be relevant is the issue of understanding tools which are still relatively new, relatively innovative, and certainly in a certain regulatory context, in a certain national context. So the question is then, how well fits the tool into the overall regulatory environment? Even if it's a weak regulatory environment, that's even a separate issue, but rather, is it fitting well within the overall architecture, the rationality, the philosophy behind a certain regulatory approach? That's another element. Of course, that then needs to be decided at the national level and based on a national discourse. Last but not least, yes, certainly no instrument can ever be, how do you say, fit for all purposes. We certainly need to look closer at specific areas for applicability, have a more like case-to-case approach, if you may. Despite that, there's certainly potential, including in this country or this sub-region, to apply these innovative tools. And perhaps by using these tools more, further promoting biodiversity, by business engagement in biodiversity policies. I mean, what puzzled me in the offset discussion was that we had this kind of tension. On the one hand, we said, well, voluntary will not be the solution in India, and I can add, nor in any other country. Otherwise, we wouldn't need environment ministry, would we? So, yes, but then on the other hand, we realized that we do have a weak regulatory environment. So if the regulatory environment, if the regulator doesn't get even the basics right, impact assessments and the action that might flow from them, how can we then expect a decent regulation for mandatory offsets? So we have that kind of conundrum here. And that's perhaps my concluding thing is perhaps, at least for the short term, what we need perhaps think about it more, how can we create more champions? And this is the question I would like to give to all of you as participants in this Sustainability Summit of the business community. Right? We have many biodiversity champions amongst you, and we heard from a few of them. But the question is, how can we create more champions? Right? How can we create some mainstream or even laggards, as I said this morning, into biodiversity champions? I don't have an answer to that. I just want to toss the question to you before concluding. So that's it from my side. I just want to say a big thank you to our discussants, panelists, presenters. I also want to thank you for your input, for your vivid contributions in the individual breakout groups. Thank you very much. Last but not least, just a word for the participants of the CBD workshop on resource mobilization. Of course, for us, the journey goes on, but on separate avenues, if you may, because we will meet tomorrow morning in the Environment Ministry to continue with the program. And I look forward to see you there. For the participants of the Sustainability Summit, I wish you nice continuation of your journey. And with that, I wish all of you a good evening.